When it comes to the Civil War, a lot of the historical debate is about what specifically caused the U.S. Civil War. Chief among those, of course, is slavery. But are there certain events in the history of the United States that paved the way for the war? And not just events, but specific pieces of legislation? And the answer to that is yes. There were several factors that led to the war. First of all, a lot of the events that led to the war can be traced to the outcome of the Mexican-American War, which, for context, ended in 1856. And chief among these debates is what to do in terms of slavery in these new territories. So the first attempt to answer that question was the Compromise of 1850, which basically was actually a series of 5 laws. So this wasn't one sweeping law. There were 5 different laws in it. Some of the highlights of those included California being admitted as a free state. So that would potentially upset the balance of free and slave states. However, newly acquired territories that were acquired during the Mexican-American War can decide on slavery for themselves. This is known as popular sovereignty. It really didn't kick in until a couple years later, but we'll get into that. Also, importantly, it outlawed slavery in D.C., in Washington, D.C., so the nation's capital could no longer have slavery. But the biggest thing to come out of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act that was a part of that series of bills as well. And it made it easier for slave owners to recover their lost slaves. As we know, lots of slaves ran away from their uh, owners in the South, and this basically required Northerners to help in returning the slaves to authorities. And it also made it much easier in the process for these slaves to be recaptured. This understandably made a lot of people in the North mad, because why should they return slaves when they themselves were against it? It meaning slavery. So the anti-slavery movement was well underway at this point, to be certain, in the 1850s. And this fugitive slave law basically just gave a lot more momentum for that movement, and it grew as a result. Next, a couple years after that, in 1850, in 1854, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which specifically deals with the issue of slavery in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And this is where popular sovereignty, as I mentioned, kicks in. Basically, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was it let the people that lived in these new territories to decide the issue of slavery for themselves. In Kansas particularly, there was a bunch of bloody battles and fighting known as Bleeding Kansas. It was a series of battles. John Brown, you might have heard of, was a huge part in Bleeding Kansas as well. And there was a big battle whether the constitution of that state should be including slavery and not. It's interesting if you would like to research that. Also, the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically repealed the Missouri Compromise, which basically uh, meant that slavery could now take place above 3630 longitude. And the Missouri Compromise helped forestall this conflict from happening. 40 years, it was passed in 1820, so it basically forestalled the inevitable conflict that would become civil war for 40 years. Lastly, there is this thing called slave power conspiracy. Basically, what this theory posited was that Congress is filled with people doing the bidding of slaveholders. It should be mentioned here that the North was a lot more populous than the South. So people thought that Congress was filled with people doing the bidding of owners so they could keep their institution of slavery going. So people thought that slave states did have more power in Congress, but the North was a lot more populous, so obviously this was unfair. And then this conspiracy contributed to the friction between North and the South, which would eventually lead to the Civil War. It combines with slavery, economics, sectionalism, and the election of Abraham Lincoln that we will discuss in future videos. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you here next week with another video, this time on the causes of the Civil War.